Today we're going to do a technology roadmap whiteboard session. This session is based on input I've had from talking to my clients, both small clients and large clients, private sector and public sector. Now the one commonality across all these clients is they all agree you can never be 100% secure. You can have the biggest security budgets and have all the latest and greatest security technologies, but you can never guarantee that your organization will not get breached. So when looking at security postures, we like to use the NIST framework. The NIST framework is based on 5 dimensions and allows you to take a holistic approach to evaluating your security posture. The first dimension is the identify phase. This is when you're doing an internal audit of your organization, looking at your crown jewels, your key assets, and trying to identify the sources of risk against those assets. Once you've built that risk profile, you can focus on trying to protect your environment. This is a mixture of people, process, and technology. You've got the security technology like the firewalls and the antivirus, but you've also got the people who are implementing those technologies, gathering the security intelligence from them, and then following process so that they can quickly respond and mitigate any breach scenarios. Now, there's always the understanding that you can never guarantee that you will never get a breach. So because of that, you need to be able to detect that situation when there is a breach and detect it quickly so that you can minimize the damage to your environment. Once a breach is being detected, you need to be able to respond. And this is a matter of quickly identifying where the breach is, determining if it's spread throughout your environment, and trying to assess the damage. Once the breach is being resolved, then you need to be able to recover. And this is a matter of post-breach doing the analysis as to what happened, what was the damage, and bring your business back up to operations. It's also important to look at the risk profile of your organization. Now, the most common risk that we think about from a security perspective is ransomware. I think every customer that I've talked to has a story about ransomware, or at a bare minimum, they know a peer group who's been affected by ransomware. Now, the thing about ransomware, it's actually one of the simplest and often the least damaging of all the breach scenarios. I like to use a poker metaphor when I think about ransomware. You've got the royal flush, best hand in the deck, and right off the bat, you're going to go all in and bet all your chips. From a hacker's perspective, it's like he's managed to get into your environment, compromise an endpoint, and right off the bat, he's telling you. He encrypts the PC and sends you a note, say, hey, I'm in your network, send me some Bitcoins. But what about those hackers who are more subtle? They prefer to lurk in the background, sort of explore within your environment and try and find the real valuable assets. In those cases, they're often looking to do some sort of exfiltration. They're trying to find those key assets and or intellectual property and steal it from you. Maybe just to steal it and hold it for ransom, maybe just to publish it and to adversely affect your brand. The recent HBO attack was an example of this, where the malicious actors got into HBO, stole their intellectual property, being TV scripts, TV content, and they published it on the internet. Now, another risk to your environment could be a denial of business operations. And this is where your operations basically stop working because of the compromise. So a good example of this was a few years ago, the Stuxnet malware. And this is where the US intelligence and Israeli intelligence allegedly created malware and used that to stop operations in some Iranian nuclear facilities. So when you look at your business, it's important to consider these sources of risk. What is the impact if some PCs got compromised with ransomware and got encrypted? How about if your key data got stolen from you or published on the internet? And then look at your key systems and think, okay, well, what would be the impact to my operations if they were no longer working, no longer available for a period of a day, a week, a month? So now we're going to look at building a security posture. And this is based on what I've seen a lot of my clients do. So we're going to tackle this from the NIST framework perspective. And we'll start off in this identify phase. So in doing this, you need to look at your organization and sort of do an evaluation on who are your users. How are they actually connecting to the network? Are they using mobile devices? Are they using laptops or some sort of VDI? And where are they working from? Are they in the office or are they sort of more mobile workers? You also need to look at your crown jewels. So what are those key applications that are sources of compromise or risk to be compromised? And it could be things like your ERP system or even just a file server. So once you've identified those key assets and the sources of risk, you need to build a strategy around protecting your environment. Now, the most common threat source of threat these days is email. And some recent studies by Cisco and Verizon found that 60% of malware is delivered by email, and typically one of two different formats. It could be an attachment in an email, which basically a malicious attachment, you click on it and it downloads malware onto your PC, or it could be some sort of email with a web link. Now, the other common source or threat vector would be the web. And this is where one of your users, they go out to the web, they click on a link, and that link downloads malicious malware into your environment. A third area could just be traditional scanning. And this is where there's a threat actor, they're on the internet, they're using tools to scan your environment and try and find holes or vulnerabilities within your environment. And then once they've found those, they exploit them to get into your environment. In the recent Equifax breaches, it was probably started off this way. They were scanning the Equifax site. They found that it hadn't, the underlying Apache web server upon which it was built hadn't been patched. And then they leveraged those patches to get into the environment and extract the data. So from a protection side of things, most organizations at a bare minimum have their firewall and some form of antivirus. The challenge with these technologies, and the reason why most organizations have or are already in the process of upgrading them, is these only protect you against a subset of these attack vectors. So they're typically protecting you against the scanning. They don't do anything to protect you against the most common attack vectors, being the email attachments and the web surfing. So that's why most clients that I have already started down the path of moving towards next generation firewall, as well as next generation cloud email protection. Now, what makes these services next generation is the fact that they're connected to some form of threat intelligence cloud. And what the Threat Intelligence Cloud, it's made up of millions of sensors spread throughout the internet all over the world. And those sensors are collecting security events and analyzing those security events, terabytes worth of security events every day. And their objective is to identify malware as soon as it's introduced onto the wild in the internet as quickly as possible. And then once it's identified, they'll use that to update all of the next generation products, firewalls, cloud email services, so that your environment is protected from that newly introduced malware. So to show the power of this Threat Intelligence Cloud, I like to use an example of a study that was done by NSS Labs last year. And basically what they did is they went back in time and they looked at all of the malware that was introduced onto the internet over the past year. And then they did a comparison between the different threat intelligence clouds to see how quickly they could identify these sources, these samples, as malicious malware after they'd been introduced. And what they found, that the highest of the threat intelligence clouds, it was able to perform at a level that within 3 minutes of being introduced into the wild, the threat intelligence cloud was able to identify those samples as malware and then update their platforms. Oh, sorry. They were able to, 92% of the malicious samples that were introduced into the wild were updated and identified as malware. Within 30 minutes, 99.7% of the samples were identified as malware, and their platforms were updated. So that just shows you how adaptable and flexible these next generation products are at identifying threats and quickly protecting against them as soon as they're introduced onto the internet. Now, the other capability that makes these platforms next generation is the fact that they have a sandbox. And the sandbox is used for those malware samples that have not yet been identified by the cloud. So let's say you've got an email that has an attachment on it, but it's not yet recognized by the cloud. So that will be sent to just to protect your environment, that will be sent to the sandbox. It will be detonated in the sandbox and its behaviors will be studied. And if there's any behaviors that are deemed malicious, the Threat Intelligence Cloud will classify that as malware. They won't let it into your corporate environment, and then they'll update the cloud so that if anyone else downloads that same file, it'll automatically be blocked as malware. Now, up to now, we've been focused on locking down or security protection within the perimeter. And really, these protection mechanisms are aimed at making sure that no malicious malware gets into your environment. It's blocking it before it actually enters your corporate environment. There is the recognition, I've found that more clients, over the past few years, a lot of clients have been focused on locking down their perimeter from a security-wise perspective. More recently, I'm sort of seeing this shift focusing more towards the internal network. And this is a recognition that you can never guarantee that you won't be breached. So organizations are starting to prepare for that scenario and trying to stop the situation where what they call lateral movement. So you've got a PC, it's being breached, and then they're using that as a jumping off point to explore throughout the network. Maybe compromise other users or maybe get into sort of more valuable corporate resources such as the ERP systems and so on. So from locking down or from protecting your internal environment, the low-hanging fruit is typically a next-generation antivirus. And the difference between the next-generation antivirus or next-generation endpoint protection is, one, it's connected to the cloud. So right off the bat, it's benefiting from all that threat intelligence that's coming from the cloud, and it's constantly up to date with all of the latest attack vectors and threats. But the other side of this is the recognition that the final target for any malware is the endpoint. So really the hackers out there, they're trying to compromise your endpoint, being it a PC or a mobile device, and then sort of use that to get into your environment. So that's why the next generation antivirus, one of the things they do is they monitor the behaviors on that end device. So as an example, let's say there's ransomware on the end device. It kicks off an encryption process. The next generation endpoint protection will recognize that encryption process as potential ransomware, and then it will block it before it causes too much damage. The other thing that malware often does is tries to make changes in settings on the actual PC. So they'll try and make registry changes, or they'll try and run scripts on the device. And really what they're trying to do is escalate their permissions on that device so that they can further compromise it, maybe load software on it, but also so that they can use that to do things like scan the rest of the environment or try and log on to other systems such as Active Directory servers and so on. So in monitoring the behavior on that end device, the next generation endpoint will see those behaviors, see that they're not normal, they're signs of malicious behavior, and then they'll block them. Now, up to now, when we've been focusing on the perimeter side of things, we've mostly been talking about prevention strategies. And these are really implementing technologies aimed at stopping any type of malware from infecting your environment. When we look at the internal network, what I'm finding is that most of the security postures are starting off with a detection security posture. And it's not that there aren't good security protection or sort of internal network protection technologies out there. There's lots of different things like microsegmentation. Cisco has a product called Identity Services Engine, which can be used for microsegmentation. There's other things like zero trust architecture. And then there's also two-factor authentication, where you're basically, before you log on to an application, you have to sign on with another factor of authentication. Just to make sure no one else is misusing your account. So there are security protection technologies aimed at the internal network. But what we're finding is that in many cases, organizations prefer to start off with a detection strategy. And the reason for that is these prevention technologies, one, they can be expensive, but two, they're fairly risky and challenging to implement. You have to have a very good understanding of all your assets within your organization, your different users, and your different level of permissions that you want to grant to each user. The risk of doing this wrong is that you could actually lock out your users from key business applications and in a way cause your own internal denial of business operations. So because of that, what I'm often seeing is organizations are focusing on starting off with a detection strategy for their internal network. And what they're doing is they're implementing a SIEM, a Security Incident Event Monitoring Platform. What the SIEM is it's a platform and it's a recognition that there's lots of sources of security intelligence within your network. And it collects the data from all of those, does the analysis of them, and then tries to identify indications of compromise. And when it does, it sends off an alarm saying that this is there's likely been a breach in your environment. So as an example, let's say your next generation antivirus product, it noticed that encryption event. It will send that notification to the SIEM. The SIEM will realize that one, this is probably a source of ransomware, but two, it's also a source that there's someone has got into your network and they actually may be using that encryption or that ransomware as a smokescreen and trying to do some other lateral movement or get into other assets within your environment. So it'll sort of start monitoring that on a going forward basis. Let's say that your ERP system has noticed that someone's tried to log on to it multiple times and it's failed. And the SIEM will it'll send that notification to the SIEM. The SIEM will also at the same time notice that those logons happened at 4 o'clock in the morning. And it will sort of see that, correlate those two events and say, you know what, this is likely an indication of compromise. Someone is trying to get into my key assets within my environment. And it could use that to send off an alarm. The next generation firewall could also send off notifications to the SIEM if someone's trying to upload terabytes worth of data up to Dropbox. That could be a sign of an exfiltration event within your environment. So what the SIEM does is it takes all of these different events, it does the machine intelligence analysis on them, and tries to identify indications of compromise. And once it has those indications of compromise, it sends out alarms so that they can be addressed. Up to now, the focus has been on security technologies. But as I mentioned before, the NIST framework talks to both technology, but also the people and process side of things. So when we look at this, we're really talking about the respond and the recover side of things. And what we're typically talking about is some form of security operations center. So the security operations center is made up of the people, those security analysts that you have within your organization. They're the ones who've implemented these security technologies, but they're also the ones who are analyzing the security intelligence that are coming from these technologies and using that to build their security postures and policies. They're the ones who will be getting these alarms from the SIM. So if the SIM has identified what it thinks to be a breach, it will send alarms to the Security Operations Center. The Security Operations Center will then use the SIM, do some triaging of those alarms. Maybe it does some searching, some queries of the actual events in process, and try and determine if they're a false positive. Or if they aren't a false positive and they're an actual source of a breach, that's when they'll start actioning their incident response plan. And they'll try and identify the source of the breach and minimize the damage before it spreads too much throughout their environment. So where does TELUS play in this security roadmap journey? We can play in all 5 dimensions or assist customers in all 5 dimensions of the NIST framework. So on the identify side, we have professional services, security experts, and they can work with you to do that internal audit, identify the sources of risk within your environment, and help you build your security profile. On the protection side of things, we can implement and help you implement these security technologies, such as the next generation firewall, the cloud email, and the next generation antivirus or endpoint protection services. At the same time, we can offer these services managed services. So we sort of supplement your own security operations center by monitoring and managing these technologies on your behalf. On the detection side, we have a managed SIM offering. So what we'll do is we'll set up this SIM platform. We'll integrate it with your environment and all your sources of logs and security intelligence within your environment. We also build customized use cases tailored towards your key assets, the sources of risk within your environment, and the types of security events that you're trying to protect yourself against. On the response side, as part of our managed SIM offering, we provide what we call SecMon, security monitoring. And what this is, it's an extension of your own internal security operations center. What we do is we do the first line triaging of any alarms or events that get escalated by the SIM. We'll see those alarms, and then we'll do that analysis of them. We'll do some further investigation to triage them and determine whether or not they're a false positive or are they an actual source of a breach or reaction to a breach. If they are a breach, we'll pass the results of our investigations off to your security operations center and then help so that you can use that in your incident response plan. And then finally, on the recovery side of things, we offer professional services on the forensics to help you understand what was the damage, post-breach assessment of the damage caused by the breach, type of information that was lost, as well as what was the source of the breach and how can you adjust your security posture so that it doesn't happen again in the future. Those are the areas where TELUS can help you on your security posture. So where is your organization on this security roadmap journey? Are you focused on locking down the perimeter to minimize the amount of malware getting into your environment? Or are you more focused on the internal network and stopping lateral movement to your crown jewels after a breach? How confident do you feel in being able to quickly detect a breach after this has happened and respond effectively to minimize damage? I hope this whiteboard session gave you some food for thought with respect to your organization's security posture.